Hello, everyone. Today we come to the emerald embrace of the Central American rainforest, where history lies buried, not beneath the desert sands, but under a dense, living canopy of green. Deep in this suffocatingly humid jungle, there are silent cities. Colossal stone pyramids rise like man-made mountains above the treetops. Their intricate plazas and majestic temples are now choked and split by the unforgiving roots of ancient tropical trees. For centuries, these ruins represented a forgotten world, a profound mystery known only to the local peoples who lived in the shadow of their sleeping stone ancestors and heard the whispers of the jungle wind passing over the empty courtyards. This was the world of the classic Maya, a civilization that, at its peak, was one of the most intellectually and artistically advanced on Earth. Their achievements were staggering and unique. They developed the only complete writing system in the ancient Americas, a script of breathtaking beauty and complexity. They created a calendar of almost unimaginable accuracy, and their priest astronomers tracked the movements of the stars and planets with a precision unmatched for 1,000 years. They were a people ruled by divine kings, shaman lords who performed strange, brutal rituals to appease the gods. They were builders of magnificent art and colossal, dazzling white cities. And then, in the heart of their southern homelands, this vibrant, intellectual world vanished. Not in a single, sudden catastrophe like Pompeii, but in a slow, mysterious, and tragic unraveling that played out over 2 centuries, seeing their greatest metropolitan centers abandoned and their vast population plummet. Why? Why did a society that could calculate the movements of Venus and build temples to the sky suddenly lose the ability to feed its own people? This is one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles, a silent wound in the heart of the Americas. Tonight, we will journey into the world of the silent cities to investigate their fall. We will first explore their golden age, the high watermark of their power. And then, like archaeologists and scientists, we will meticulously examine the clues left behind in the stones, in the art, and in the very earth beneath the ruined temples. Clues that point not to a single disaster, but to a perfect storm of endemic warfare, catastrophic, unprecedented drought, and a civilization-wide environmental disaster brought on by their own success. But before our journey takes us deep into the green heart of the jungle, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me, ensuring we can continue to bring these long-forgotten stories back to life. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Our journey takes us to the profound and haunting mystery of the silent cities. For centuries, the great stone cities of the Maya slept, wrapped in the tight, green embrace of the Central American rainforest. To the outside world, especially the rapidly industrializing Western world of the 19th century, they simply did not exist. Vague rumors and scattered reports filtered back through Spanish missionaries or local woodsmen, telling of strange stone idols and vast, collapsed palaces hidden deep in the impenetrable jungle. But these accounts were largely dismissed as fantastical tall tales. The prevailing and deeply prejudiced wisdom of the time held that no great, sophisticated indigenous civilization could have possibly risen in the Americas. The ruins, if they were real at all, must have been the work of some exotic, foreign race. Perhaps Egyptians, a lost tribe of Israel, or even the remnants of Plato's lost continent of Atlantis. This prejudice would be shattered by the work of a remarkable pair of men whose names deserve to be etched alongside the great explorers of history. One was John Lloyd Stevens, an American lawyer, diplomat, and celebrated travel writer. A man with an insatiable, restless curiosity for the forgotten corners of the world. The other was Frederick Catherwood, a British architect and artist of immense, almost unparalleled talent. Catherwood was gifted with a meticulous eye for architectural detail and a steady, almost photographic hand that could capture the most complex forms. In 1839, drawn by the persistent whispers of these lost, unknown cities, they set out on an audacious expedition into the largely unmapped and politically volatile jungles of what is now Honduras and Guatemala. Their journey was grueling in the extreme. They traveled by mule through a dense, suffocatingly humid rainforest, a place of oppressive heat and absolute isolation. They were constantly plagued by biting insects, immobilizing mud, and torrential, unceasing rain. To make matters worse, they found themselves in the middle of a chaotic, brutal civil war, forcing them to negotiate safe passage with suspicious, heavily armed local generals who saw them as spies or perhaps just rich fools. But the two men pressed on, following a local guide until one day, after months of hardship, they arrived at a site near the Copan River in Honduras. Hacking their way through the thick undergrowth with machetes, they stumbled into a clearing, and what they saw there, rising from the jungle floor, changed the course of history forever. Before them stood magnificent stone monuments, or stelae, intricately carved from top to bottom with the portraits of strange, regal kings and complex, swirling geometric symbols unlike anything they had ever seen. The level of artistic and engineering sophistication was immediately apparent. Catherwood, the trained architect, was stunned by the quality of the art, instantly recognizing it as the work of a culture as sophisticated and ancient as that of the ancient Egypt or Greece. An astonishing insight in a world that thought nothing of this caliber existed in the Americas. But it was Stevens, the lawyer and diplomat, who grasped the true, monumental significance. These are not the works of a foreign, old-world people. This was the unique, powerful, and utterly forgotten legacy of an indigenous American civilization. So convinced was he of its importance, and so determined to protect it from looters, he formally purchased the entire lost city from its bewildered local owner for the now legendary sum of $50. While Stevens began to meticulously document their journey in his journal, Catherwood set to his painstaking work. In the sweltering, insect-infested heat, his hands swollen from bites, he employed a device called a camera lucida to project the faint images of the carvings onto his paper. This allowed him to trace their complex, three-dimensional details with an accuracy that had never before been possible in ruined documentation. His resulting, stunningly evocative drawings were not romantic, idealized fantasies. They were precise, architectural, and artistic records, the first true visual account of the Maya world ever seen by the public. The silence had been broken by the scratch of a pen. The initial discovery at Copan was merely the beginning of the great revelation. Stevens and Catherwood's journey continued, revealing one architectural marvel after another, penetrating deeper into the core of the ancient Maya world. They explored the elegant, multi-storied Palenque in Mexico, where delicate stucco reliefs of kings and gods seemed to emerge from the perpetual jungle mist. They reached the colossal ruins of Tikal in Guatemala, a site where the tallest stone pyramids in the Americas rose like man-made mountains, their dizzying, temple-crowned peaks actually breaking through the vast green canopy of the rainforest. When Stevens finally published his account, incidents of travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, filled with Catherwood's breathtaking, precise illustrations, it became an international sensation. It was more than a travelogue. It was a profound, irrefutable statement. It proved beyond any doubt that a great, sophisticated civilization had not only risen, but also fallen in the Americas long before the arrival of Columbus. The silent cities had been found. The world now knew that they existed, but an even more profound mystery had been uncovered. Who were the people who built these magnificent cities, and why? After centuries of brilliance, had they simply abandoned them to the jungle? The astonishing discoveries of Stevens and Catherwood had opened a window into a new and complex historical world. What emerged from the ensuing archaeological work was a picture of a civilization that, for over 6 centuries, from roughly 250 to 900 AD, dominated the intellectual and artistic landscape of ancient America. This was the era known as the Classic Maya. It is crucial to understand that the Maya were not a single unified empire ruled from one great, centralized capital. Their world was a dynamic, often volatile, and highly competitive network of dozens of independent city-states. Each of these polities, often referred to as kingdoms, controlled its own territory and constantly vied for regional influence and prestige. Great cities like Tikal and Palenque, Copan, and the mighty serpent kingdom of Calakmul were less like provinces of an empire and more like warring medieval kingdoms, rivals, neighbors, and occasional allies. Their history, which we can now meticulously read from the stone monuments left behind, is one of constantly shifting political alliances, strategic royal marriages to cement those alliances, and intense, ritualized warfare to gain dominance. The very fabric of this entire sophisticated civilization, the substance that allowed them to build the Great Pyramids and fueled their complex society, was dependent upon a single sacred plant, maize or corn. The Maya understood themselves, first and foremost, as the people of the corn. It was not merely their primary food source, an agricultural staple to sustain life. It was the very center of their religion, their cosmology, and their deepest sense of identity. Their entire existence, from the highest king to the humblest farmer, was a sacred, vital partnership with this single crop. The dependency on maize was absolute, yet presented a continuous, difficult challenge in the thin, fragile soil and the unpredictable rainfall of the tropical rainforest environment. This was not the rich, fertile land of the Nile or the Mesopotamian river valleys. It was a world that required constant ingenuity to sustain a vast, dense population. To survive, the Maya developed ingenious agricultural techniques that transformed the landscape. They practiced sophisticated slash-and-burn farming in small jungle plots, built elaborate terraces on hillsides to prevent erosion, and most impressively, created raised, irrigated fields, known as chinampas, in the vast swamps and low-lying areas. The entire cycle of planting, growth, and harvest was not just an economic task. It was the central sacred drama of their lives, mirroring the birth, death, and resurrection of the maize god himself. At the heart of this sacred drama stood the king, whom they called the Kuhula Jah, or Holy Lord. The Maya king was a figure of spectacular, terrifying power, but he was not simply a political ruler or a military general. He was, fundamentally, a divine shaman, the chief, living intermediary between the mortal world of his subjects and the supernatural realm of the gods and the royal ancestors. His primary duty was not to govern in a bureaucratic sense, but to perform the sacred rituals that maintained the order of the entire cosmos. It was his sacred responsibility to ensure that the sun would rise each day, that the celestial clock would keep turning, and, most critically, that the seasonal rains would come to allow the maize to grow. The fate of his people literally rested on his piety and his ritual prowess. To fulfill this profound and dangerous duty, the king's most potent offering, the one that the gods truly demanded, was his own sacred blood. In deeply important ceremonies, often public and intensely dramatic, the Ajah would perform a ritual of bloodletting. Using a terrifyingly sharp obsidian lancet, a stingray spine, or a sharpened piece of bone, he would pierce a sensitive part of his own body, such as his tongue, his earlobes, or his penis, allowing his sacred blood to fall on his strips of bark paper held in a bowl. This blood-soaked paper was then set alight and burned. In the swirling smoke that rose to the sky, it was believed that a supernatural portal would open, manifesting as a great, undulating vision serpent, through which the king could communicate directly with the gods and the powerful royal ancestors, petitioning them for the survival of his people. This was the great, yet fragile, cosmic bargain at the heart of Maya civilization. The people fed the king with tribute from their cornfields, and the king, in turn, fed the gods with his own sacred blood. As long as this perilous bargain held, the universe was believed to be in balance, the cities flourished, and the vital maize would grow. It was a powerful, deeply ingrained, and utterly compelling system of belief, but it rested on a terrifying and dangerous promise. that the king's personal, bloody piety could, in fact, control the sky itself. For decades after their rediscovery by Stevens and Catherwood, the silent cities of the Maya kept their most important secrets hidden in plain sight. The intricate carvings that covered their magnificent monuments, temples, and palaces were a profound, beautiful puzzle. Scholars, most often hindered by the same prejudices that delayed the initial discovery, looked at the glyphs and saw not a language, but a mysterious collection of symbolic pictures and elaborate decorations. They concluded that the true, detailed story of the Maya, their dynastic histories, their alliances, their personal triumphs and defeats, was lost forever, a story that would remain unreadable and inarticulate. But they were profoundly wrong. Hidden within those beautiful, complex carvings was not just a collection of symbols, but the only true writing system ever fully developed in the ancient Americas, a powerful, articulate voice that, once understood, would allow the silent cities to finally tell their own 6-century-long history. Unlike a simple alphabet where each symbol represents a sound, the Maya script was a sophisticated and beautiful logosyllabic system. This means that some of its glyphs or symbols represent whole words, logograms, while others represent phonetic syllables, like ka, ba, or tu. A brilliant scribe, a member of the highly educated elite, could write the same word in multiple ways, either with a single, intricate picture glyph or by carefully spelling it out syllable by syllable, often to create a beautiful visual effect. These glyphs were artfully arranged into square blocks, and their texts were written in paired columns, read in a specific, intricate pattern, from left to right and top to bottom in a zigzag pattern. For centuries, this complexity, combined with the sheer artistic nature of the script, made it seem utterly impenetrable, appearing more like a work of art than a functional language. The key to finally unlocking their writing, and indeed their entire precise, ordered worldview, was to first understand their advanced system of mathematics. The Maya developed a vigesimal, or base 20, number system of elegant, abstract simplicity. A single dot represented the number 1. A horizontal bar represented the number 5. And a stylized shell symbol represented a concept that was, for its time, a stroke of pure, intellectual genius. 0. The independent invention of 0 was a monumental intellectual leap, an abstract tool that many other great, practical civilizations, including the mighty Romans, never truly grasped. For the Maya, it was not merely a placeholder. It was an essential mathematical tool, allowing them to make calculations that reached into the millions and to track the vast, spiraling cycles of time with what seemed like perfect, almost divine precision. This mathematical mastery was the Rosetta Stone that revealed the logic behind the scribe's complex, flowing hands. Time, for the Maya, was a sacred obsession. It was not a linear progression from past to future, but a vast, intricate, and repeating cycle of births and deaths, of creation and destruction. Reflecting this worldview, they did not rely on one calendar, but a series of complex, interlocking systems that governed every single aspect of their lives, from the planting of seed to the declaration of a war. The first and most esoteric was the Tsokin, a 260-day sacred calendar used by priests for divination, determining auspicious days for ceremonies and naming children. Running parallel to this was the Hab, a 365-day solar calendar that governed the mundane agricultural seasons. These two calendars worked together with the precision of intricate, finely cut gears, creating a larger, defining cycle known as the calendar round, which repeated itself every 52 years. But to track their history across even vaster, cosmological spans of time, the Maya created their most stunning achievement, the long count. This was a linear, unbelievably accurate count of the number of days that had passed since a mythical creation date, which corresponds to the year 3114 BC in our modern system. It is this long count, carved onto their stone monuments with their dot and bar notation and specific glyphs, that allows archaeologists today to date the reigns of their kings, the triumphs of their armies, and the history of their cities with an accuracy unparalleled in the rest of the ancient world. This mastery of mathematics, and the resulting obsession with timekeeping, was driven by a profound and incredibly patient observation of the cosmos. Maya, priest astronomers, working from observatories built atop their imposing pyramids, tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets with unbelievable accuracy. They could predict solar and lunar eclipses, which they saw as powerful, often dangerous omens requiring immediate ritual attention from the king. They were particularly and intensely obsessed with the cycles of the planet Venus, which they associated with warfare, sacrifice, and the timing of major sacred rituals. The glyphs, the mathematics, the calendars, and the astronomy were all, in the end, part of a single, unified quest, a magnificent intellectual mission to understand the divine order of the universe itself. The Mayas saw the cosmos not as a place of chaos or random chance, but as a vast, intricate, and perfectly predictable machine governed by the repeating, measurable cycles of time. Their great challenge was to decipher the precise workings of this cosmic machine and to align their fragile society with its sacred, perfect rhythms through precise rituals and meticulous record-keeping. The universe, to them, was a powerful, detailed text written in the precise language of the stars and the numbers, and they were its devoted and brilliant readers. It was this deep, ordered faith that allowed them to build their glittering world, a world that, around the year 750 AD, must have seemed utterly eternal. At its absolute height, around the year 750 AD, the world of the classic Maya must have seemed an unshakable, eternal reality. The great city-states of the southern lowlands were thriving metropolises. Tikal, with its towering, sky-piercing temple pyramids, was a bustling center of commerce, power, and ritual, housing tens of thousands of people. The kings of Kalakmul, the mighty serpent kingdom, had established a sprawling, complex network of vassal states that spanned much of the central Maya region. At Copan, the kingdom of the sun-eyed king, the finest artisans in the Americas were carving some of the most complex, beautiful, and extensive monuments in the entire ancient world. The overall population was at its peak, the sacred traditions were strong, and the intricate, elegant gears of the sacred calendar seemed to promise a predictable and divinely ordered future for generations to come. But this glittering peak was, in fact, the high watermark just before a long, tragic, and mysterious fall. The first, most stark sign that something was going profoundly, catastrophically wrong is literally written in stone, or perhaps more accurately, in the sudden and chilling absence of that writing. For centuries, the Maya kings, driven by their divine mandate and an intense rivalry for prestige, had obsessively chronicled their reigns and their victories. They would dedicate magnificent, tall, carved stone monuments, the stelae, to mark important dates and military triumphs, all dated with their precise long count calendar. It is this very accuracy and obsession with time that allows us, the historians of today, to track the unraveling of their world as it happened. Starting in the late 8th century, a deadly trend emerged. One by one, the great cities of the south began to fall silent. At Palenque, the elegant city of Lord Pakal, the last dated monument is a dedicatory altar from 799 AD. At Copan, the famed kingdom of the magnificent stelae, the last date recorded is a final, isolated inscription from 822 AD. The last great monument commissioned at the powerful superpower city of Tikal is a stela from 869 AD. After these specific, documented dates, the tradition that had defined their civilization for centuries, the public declaration of the king's power and the cosmic order, simply stops. The kings were no longer commissioning these great stone declarations. This sudden, inexplicable silence in the meticulously kept archaeological record is a stark and chilling testament to a system in its death throes. The public, authoritative voice of the divine kings was being extinguished, leaving behind only the echo of their final, desperate declarations. It was as if the record keepers themselves had run out of time. The sudden silence of the Stele was just the beginning. Further, undeniable evidence of this profound societal breakdown was found in the very physical hearts of the great cities, the ceremonial centers that were meant to be the eternal focus of the kingdom. Archaeologists have uncovered massive, grand construction projects, new temples, ambitious expansions to palaces, grand ceremonial causeways that were left mysteriously and abruptly unfinished. It presents a ghostly, unnerving sight. Vast ceremonial plazas only half paved with limestone, and intricately carved stone blocks left abandoned in the quarry or along the ancient roadways, sometimes with the stonemasons' tools lying next to them. It is as if the thousands of laborers and master stonemasons simply put down their tools one day and walked away, never to return. The colossal engine of the Maya civilization, driven by royal power and ritual, was grinding to an undeniable halt. The breakdown extended far beyond construction. In these final, desperate years of the classic period, the very character of the cities began to change. At some sites, we see a stark deviation from the confident, open design of the Golden Age. There is clear evidence of hastily built, crude fortifications, makeshift walls, wooden palisades, and simple moats being thrown up around the central palaces and temples. This was a direct, unmistakable signal that the world of the elite was suddenly living in fear, turning inward against an unseen, yet very real, threat. At the same time, the quality and flow of elite goods show a marked and rapid decline. The production of sophisticated painted pottery, once a high art form, becomes crude, the carving of precious jade becomes less refined, and essential long-distance trade goods, like the vital salt for preservation and the sharp obsidian for tools and weapons, grew scarce. The sophisticated trade networks that had supplied the great cities with these luxury and essential items were clearly breaking down under pressure, and the ranks of the master craftsmen, those who symbolized the city's prestige, were thinning or fleeing. The wealth, the security, and the social order that sustained the elite were evaporating. The decline was total in the southern heartland. Yet, it is also crucial to avoid a common misconception that this was a single, monolithic event that affected all Maya people equally. The collapse was specifically centered on the great, ancient cities of the southern lowlands, the traditional, intellectual, and political heartland of the civilization. While Tikal and Calakmul were dying and emptying out, cities further north in the Yucatan Peninsula, such as Chichen Itza and Uxmal, were actually beginning to enter a new, vibrant period of growth and immense influence. A final, brilliant flowering of the Maya culture that would last for centuries more. But in the south, the evidence is undeniable and tragic. Over a period of about 150 years, the great ancient cities that had stood for 6 centuries emptied out, the population dispersing. A complex, brilliant civilization simply unraveled, its people vanishing from their magnificent, ghost-filled homes. The overwhelming silence of the abandoned temples and the final, haunting dates on the stone stele pose the great question that has challenged historians and archaeologists for over a century. What happened here? Why did they leave? It is a common error of history to paint the Maya collapse with a single brushstroke, but the story is far more nuanced, revealing a civilization that fractured rather than simply ceased to be. The catastrophic failure was a regional phenomenon, centered on the vulnerable, densely populated southern lowlands, while simultaneously, a different, vibrant world was taking shape hundreds of miles to the north. As we saw the final dates carved onto the stele at Tikal and Copan, the heartland of the Classic Age, the great cities of the northern Yucatan Peninsula were experiencing a resurgence, entering a post-classic era of remarkable architectural and political innovation. Cities like Chichen Itza were not just surviving. They were evolving into new centers of power, absorbing influences from central Mexico and developing a distinct and brilliant new style of art and governance. This fact is vital. The Maya people did not vanish. Their classic political system, the one based on the divine authority of the Kuhulajaw and the competitive city-state rivalry of the lowlands, is what collapsed. The failure was a systemic, political, and ecological implosion, not an ethnic cleansing or a simple disappearance. The population of the southern lowlands didn't die out entirely. Rather, the great urban centers, the seats of the divine kings, became utterly unsustainable. The common people, the farmers and laborers who had sustained these massive cities, simply left the centers of power, dispersing into the countryside, where life, while harder, was at least more sustainable than in a massive, starving metropolis. The focus of the civilization, the intellectual and political gravity, shifted radically to the north, which was governed by different political structures and possessed a different, slightly less vulnerable environment. This contrast is the key to understanding the sheer depth of the tragedy in the South. In the North, new cities and different ruling elites managed to weather the coming storms, adapting their economy and political structure. In the South, however, the very institutions that defined the Classic Age, the absolute power of the Divine King, the obsessive architectural competition, and the intense rivalry between neighboring states, would be the very things that made them uniquely fragile when the environment finally turned against them. The silence that fell over Tikal was a silence of royal authority and urban life, a haunting sign of the complete failure of the Old Covenant. The people who remained were those who had, for a time, abandoned the grand vision for simple survival. The profound question remains rooted in the southern jungle. What combination of forces could so completely destroy the heartland's ability to sustain its magnificent cities? As archaeologists began to decipher the complex Maya script and piece together the dynastic history of the great southern cities, a dramatic and violently escalating picture emerged, one that offers the first major, compelling theory for the collapse. For centuries, warfare had been an integral, almost ritualized part of Maya civilization, but it was conflict with a very unique, contained character. For the most part, classic Maya warfare was a highly ritualized and strategically limited affair. The goal was not typically to conquer vast territories, annex entire states, or annihilate enemy populations in the modern sense. Instead, the primary objective was to capture rival kings and high-ranking nobles. These elite captives were then taken back in triumph to the victor city, where they would be publicly humiliated, tortured, and ultimately sacrificed in grand religious ceremonies. This horrific spectacle served a dual purpose: to appease the demanding gods with royal blood and, just as importantly, to demonstrate the overwhelming power and divine favor of the victorious king, the Ajah. This ritualized conflict, while brutal, had a stabilizing effect on the political system for centuries. But in the final, desperate century of the Classic period, during the time of the Great Unraveling, the evidence shows that the very nature of this warfare began to change radically. The art carved onto the monuments and painted on palace walls becomes visibly grimmer, more chaotic, and less focused on ritual. The earlier, formal depictions of a single victorious king capturing one rival lord are replaced by desperate, panoramic scenes of mass conflict. We see massed armies clashing violently in the jungle, warriors in fearsome jaguar pelts and feathered headdresses battling fiercely over hastily constructed wooden palisades, and dozens of bound, miserable captives being presented for judgment. The magnificent and famously graphic murals at the site of Bonampak, for instance, depict a brutal, sweeping battle followed by a horrifying scene of captured nobles having their fingernails ripped out before their final mass sacrifice. This artistic shift, from a formalized portrait of a king's triumph to the frantic depiction of mass violence, is confirmed by what has been found in the ground. At once open and confident cities like Tikal, archaeologists have discovered the remains of hastily constructed, crude defensive walls and moats thrown up around the central temples and palaces. These were not the grand, meticulously planned fortifications of a professional military culture. They were desperate, last-ditch efforts of a society that was suddenly living in terror, suggesting that warfare was no longer limited to the battlefield, but was threatening the very heart of the capital city. The rules of the game had been abandoned for a brutal struggle for survival. The archaeological findings paint a clear, violent picture of a world gone mad, with escalating conflict. The discovery of mass graves at certain Maya sites further underscores the grim shift in military objectives. Excavators have found numerous skeletons showing clear, violent signs of death, blunt force trauma, obsidian blade wounds, and evidence of execution, suggesting large-scale, indiscriminate conflict that went far beyond the traditional capture of a few high-value elites. This was not ritualized sacrifice. It was war directed at a much wider segment of the population. One of the most detailed and chilling pictures of this escalating violence comes from the Petexbatan region of Guatemala, a crucial corridor in the southern lowlands. Here, a powerful dynasty of kings at the city of Dos Pilas embarked on a campaign of aggressive, expansionist warfare against their neighbors, chronicling their triumphs with a hubristic fervor. For a time, their aggression was devastatingly successful, and they created a small, powerful regional empire through conquest. But their relentless aggression ultimately proved fatal, triggering a death spiral of constant, brutal retaliatory conflict that consumed the entire region. The surrounding states, sick of the overreach and constant raids, formed alliances and turned on the Dos Pilas dynasty. The final capital of the dynasty, Aguatica, was abandoned so rapidly and in such terror that it provides a unique archaeological snapshot of the final moments of the city. Archaeologists found everyday life frozen in time. Meals were left half-eaten in the kitchens, and valuable portable objects, things that no one would leave behind unless in the most extreme haste, were left scattered on the floors of the houses. The city was hastily fortified with a massive, deep defensive ditch and a wooden palisade, demonstrating a last-ditch effort to hold out against an attack that they knew was coming. The entire city was simply deserted by its population in the face of an overwhelming threat. The evidence of mass flight and desperate, hurried defense across the region leads to the first major, compelling theory for the Maya collapse: the highly ritualized, endemic warfare that had been a stable, defining part of their political system for centuries simply spun out of control. The intense, competitive nature of their independent city-states, the very structure that fueled their architectural arms race and intellectual rivalries, became their fatal flaw. The escalating warfare between the Maya city-states provides a powerful, violent picture of the final years of the Classic period, a world consumed by its own brutal dynamic. But the war theory alone still doesn't answer the deeper question that shadows the silent cities. Why did the violence spiral so completely out of control, abandoning all the old rules? The answer lies in the catastrophic consequences of this unchecked conflict. A series of escalating, desperate wars would have created a domino effect of societal breakdown that was impossible to recover from. Constant, brutal fighting made it increasingly impossible for farmers to tend their scattered fields in safety, leading directly to a sudden, devastating food shortage. Even a temporary disruption of the planting and harvesting cycles of maize would have had an immediate, lethal impact on a population that relied solely on its local production. Furthermore, constant warfare would have violently disrupted the vital, long-distance trade routes that brought in essential, non-local goods. Cities depended on these routes for salt, which was critical for food preservation, and obsidian, a volcanic glass that was necessary for making the sharpest tools and weapons. As trade broke down, resources became scarce, driving up the need for conflict in a deadly feedback loop. The scarcity made the war worse, and the war made the scarcity worse. Perhaps most critically, the constant fighting led to a profound crisis of faith in the entire political religious system. The Kuhulajaw, the divine king, based his absolute power on his ability to communicate with the gods, win wars, and protect his people. As kings began to lose battles, as their cities were successfully raided, and as they proved unable to protect the common farmers from attack or the city from starvation, the population's faith in the king's entire divine mandate would have crumbled. If the king's sacred bloodletting could not bring victory or peace, then the entire cosmic bargain was broken. The people would have ceased to provide the king with the tribute that fueled the city, forcing them to abandon the urban centers for the perceived safety of the dispersed countryside. Therefore, the spiraling warfare was not just a symptom of the collapse, it was a critical accelerant. But what started this deadly acceleration? What pushed a centuries-old, ritualized system of conflict over the edge into total existential war? A growing body of scientific evidence suggests that the Maya were not just fighting each other. They were fighting a losing battle against their own environment, a battle brought on by the very success of their magnificent civilization. The environmental theory suggests that the Maya collapse was, in a profound sense, a self-inflicted wound, a tragic consequence of their own brilliance and their demographic success. The tropical rainforest of the Maya heartland is a seductive but utterly deceptive landscape. It appears eternally lush and fertile, a world of overwhelming, vibrant life. But in reality, its soils are surprisingly thin, fragile, and easily depleted of their vital nutrients. Supporting a massive, dense population, some estimates put the southern lowlands at over 10 million people at its peak. And this environment required not just brilliant agricultural engineering, but also meticulous, careful management. For centuries, the Maya were masters of this careful dance, using their sophisticated techniques of terracing and raised fields to feed their rapidly growing cities. But as their population swelled to its absolute peak in the 8th century, the pressure on the land became immense, unsustainable, and relentless. The first, most obvious demand was for food. A single city like Tikal may have housed a core population of 60,000, and a surrounding region of hundreds of thousands more, requiring vast, relentless areas of the surrounding forest to be cleared for the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash. The very foundations of the jungle were being steadily peeled back. However, the second, and perhaps even more voracious, demand that put an unprecedented stress on the environment was their magnificent architecture. The iconic Maya pyramids and palaces were not left as rough, bare stone. They were covered in a thick, smooth, and brilliant coating of brilliant white lime plaster, or stucco, which was then often painted in vibrant colors. This process of plaster production had a staggering, hidden environmental cost. To create this essential plaster, the Maya had to quarry massive quantities of limestone rock and then burn it at an extremely high temperature in kilns. The only fuel available for this industrial-scale process was vast quantities of green, living wood from the surrounding forest. This put the Maya on a catastrophic collision course with their environment. The very things that symbolized their power and prestige, their huge populations and their dazzling, white cities, were the seeds of their own ecological downfall. The need for lime plaster became an obsession, a relentless engine of deforestation driven by the competitive pride of the Kuhula-Jaw. Archaeologists have calculated the truly staggering environmental cost of this architectural tradition, providing a horrifying metric of the land's consumption. To produce the lime plaster for just one of the Great Pyramids at Tikal would have required the felling of nearly 1,000 acres of pristine, old-growth forest. Multiply this by the hundreds of structures, plazas, and ball courts built and continually rebuilt across dozens of rival city-states for centuries. As rival kings competed in a kind of frantic, desperate architectural arms race, each trying to outdo the other by building ever grander, ever higher temples to the gods, and even more dazzling monuments to their own glory. The rate of deforestation accelerated dramatically, far exceeding the jungle's ability to regenerate. In the centuries leading up to the collapse, the landscape around the great cities was systematically transformed. What was once a dense, humid jungle, a living repository of life and resources, was likely turned into a bleak patchwork of maize cornfields and barren, denuded hillsides where trees once stood. This widespread, unchecked deforestation triggered a cascade of devastating environmental consequences, destabilizing the entire ecological foundation of their civilization. Without the complex, deep-root systems of the trees to anchor the thin, vulnerable topsoil, the intense, torrential seasonal rains, which were so vital for their crops, turned into an enemy. The soil was no longer held in place. It was simply washed away in massive quantities, eroding into the rivers and lowland swamps, choking the waterways, and, most critically, destroying the fertility of the surrounding farmland. The very land that was meant to feed the vast cities was literally disappearing downriver. But the destruction didn't end there. Widespread deforestation has a direct and measurable effect on the local climate itself. The environmental damage wrought by the Mayas' relentless expansion and their architectural demands set off a destructive ecological feedback loop. Deforestation fundamentally alters the local climate, reducing the amount of moisture the land retains and releases back into the atmosphere through transpiration. This process can potentially make the crucial dry seasons even longer and more severe, preheating the environment for future droughts. The air itself became drier, more prone to heat, and less reliable. Furthermore, the loss of the deep jungle canopy meant the loss of vital, everyday resources the Maya depended on for their very survival. Gone were the game animals that supplemented their heavily maize-based diet, the wood necessary for building homes and cooking the daily meals, and a vast, diverse pharmacy of medicinal plants that had been crucial to their health and well-being. The massive, sophisticated cities had, in essence, created a desert of their own making on the jungle floor, isolating themselves from the very resources they needed to survive. The evidence for this extensive environmental degradation is not simply theoretical. It is written in the mud at the bottom of the region's ancient lakes. Scientists, acting as specialized historical detectives, have drilled deep into these lake beds, extracting long cores of sediment that hold the story of the past. Within these cores, the ancient pollen trapped in the microscopic layers of sediment acts as a natural time capsule. In the layers corresponding to the late Classic period, the very time of the collapse, they see a dramatic, unmistakable drop in tree pollen and, simultaneously, a massive spike in the pollen of weeds, a clear, irrefutable signature of widespread deforestation and abandoned fields. At the same time, the sediment layers themselves become thick with eroded soil, washed down from the surrounding, now barren hillsides, and carried into the lake, recording the catastrophic loss of farmland. The very things that were the proud hallmarks of the classic Maya success, their large, dense urban populations and their monumental, dazzling white cities, appear to have been the seeds of their own destruction. By pushing their fragile, tropical environment beyond its absolute breaking point, they created a brilliant but incredibly brittle civilization with literally no margin for error. They had, in a sense, inflicted a grievous, systemic wound upon their own world, leaving it fragile and hopelessly exposed to the final, fatal blows that were inevitably to come. The environment had been weakened, and the inevitable crisis would be magnified tenfold. The environmental evidence gathered from the lake beds offers a powerful, tangible metric for the self-destruction of the Maya heartland. The lake core analysis is a feat of modern scientific archaeology, a meticulous, microscopic reading of historical trauma. When scientists analyze the sediment, they're not just looking for tree pollen. They're studying a massive change in the ratio of organic material to eroded, inorganic soil. Before the Classic period, the sediment is rich with organic matter from the stable forest. But as the population grew and the axes felled the trees, the amount of coarse, clay-rich soil, the signature of runoff from deforested hills, skyrocketed. This sudden shift indicates a widespread erosional crisis that directly corresponds to the dates of the societal unraveling, proving that the land's carrying capacity was violently overstepped. This is the scientific signature of destruction, a civilization that devoured its own ecological foundation to build its spectacular temples. The story of endemic, spiraling warfare and self-inflicted environmental damage reveals a classic Maya civilization that was becoming dangerously, mortally unstable. Its complex political and ecological foundations were stressed to the breaking point, but what force delivered the final, decisive blow that shattered their world? To find that ultimate catalyst, we must look not to the earth beneath their feet, but to the silent, empty sky above their temples. The Maya were a civilization built entirely on a profound, terrifying covenant with the rain. Their entire sophisticated agricultural system, which sustained millions of people, was utterly dependent on the predictable, heavy seasonal downpours that would replenish their massive, carefully engineered man-made reservoirs and nourish their fields of maize. For centuries, this sacred covenant held true, ensuring the survival of the Kuhul Ajah and the glory of their cities. But in the final, desperate years of the Classic period, as the population peaked and the forest disappeared, the sky fell silent. For a long time, the idea of a catastrophic civilization-ending drought was just one theory among many, a plausible but ultimately unproven hypothesis with little direct evidence. The climate of the ancient world was thought to be unreadable with the accuracy needed to explain such a specific, dramatic collapse. But in recent decades, a new generation of scientists, acting as historical detectives with highly advanced tools, has found a way to read the climate of the distant past with astonishing precision. They discovered natural archives, geological time capsules, that have meticulously recorded the rainfall of every single year, sometimes every single month for thousands of years. Their method involves two critical, independent lines of evidence. First, they drilled deep into the beds of the region's lakes, extracting long, cylindrical cores of sediment that stretch back millennia. In the layers of mud, they can measure the concentration of gypsum, a mineral that precipitates out of the water in greater amounts during periods of high evaporation and low water levels. The more gypsum, the clearer the chemical signature of drought. Second, an even more precise, almost month-by-month record is kept in the region's vast, silent underground caves. Here, over millennia, water dripping from the ceiling has formed colossal stone formations known as stalagmites or speleothems. Like the rings of a tree, these stone formations grow in microscopic annual layers. By meticulously analyzing the oxygen isotopes, the chemical fingerprint of the water source, trapped within each layer, paleoclimatologists can reconstruct ancient weather patterns with astonishing accuracy. The greater the amount of the heavy oxygen isotope, 18O, the less water was available, indicating a period of severe aridity. When these two independent records from the lake beds and the caves were finally cross-referenced and the data synchronized with the Maya long count calendar dates, they told the same unambiguous, terrifying story. The silence in the stone was mirrored by the silence in the sky. The scientific data provided the ultimate historical shock. It revealed that the entire period of the classic Maya's greatest growth, from roughly 300 to 600 AD, the time of their magnificent temple building and population boom, had corresponded almost perfectly to a time of unusually high and reliable rainfall. This benevolent climate, a wet phase that lasted for centuries, allowed their population to boom and their great, water-intensive cities to flourish. It created a false sense of eternal security. But then, beginning around the year 750 AD, just as the southern cities began their mysterious and tragic unraveling, the climate shifted suddenly and violently. The region was plunged into a prolonged, century-long period of severe, devastating drought, punctuated by a series of colossal, multi-decade megadroughts that were unlike anything the civilization had ever endured. These were not just bad years. They were generational failures of the vital seasonal rains. The impact on a society already stressed by warfare and environmental destruction would have been nothing short of apocalyptic. The great, meticulously constructed reservoirs that were the pride and the lifeblood of cities like Tikal, the only sources of water for the massive urban populations during the dry season, would have slowly, terrifyingly evaporated, shrinking into vast plains of cracked, dry mud. The maize crop, the very foundation of their entire religious and social society, would have failed season after season, leading to catastrophic famine and widespread, debilitating malnutrition among the masses. The thin, fragile topsoil, no longer protected by the forest canopy and now baked hard by the relentless sun, offered no hope of recovery. Even the jungle itself, which seemed so eternally lush, would have begun to wither, its deep water table dropping until even the sacred sinkhole wells, the cenotes, ran dry or became too polluted to drink. The great cities, with their tens of thousands of inhabitants crammed together, relying on central water sources, would have quickly become death traps, places of starvation, disease, and maddening thirst. The physical reality of the megadroughts in the classic Maya cities defies easy comprehension. Imagine the vast, white plazas, once throbbing with the life of the market and the drumbeat of ritual, now silent under a scorching, pitiless sun. The great reservoirs, symbols of the king's power, had turned into a desperate, dusty wasteland. The city, which was supposed to be a place of divine order and plenty, became the most dangerous place to be. The powerful scientific evidence of the drought provides the most compelling driver for the collapse, the final, inescapable trigger. While escalating warfare and the self-inflicted deforestation had already severely weakened the Maya, reducing their ability to cope with any crisis, it was this catastrophic, century-long change in the climate that delivered the final, unrecoverable blows. The two stresses, environmental and social, met the one unanswerable force, a silent sky. Into this apocalyptic scenario stepped the divine kings, the Ajah, whose power rested entirely on their claim to be able to bring the seasonal rain through their sacred bloodletting rituals. Faced with the relentless failure of the sky, they would have performed ever more desperate, ever more elaborate ceremonies, perhaps with an increasing number of human sacrifices in a desperate plea to the angry gods. But the sky remained terrifyingly, absolutely silent. The drought became the ultimate, final test of the cosmic bargain. The king could feed the gods with his blood, but if the gods refused to answer, then the entire, magnificent system was a lie. As the rains failed, so too did the people's faith in the very political and religious system that had governed their lives for centuries. The total, unyielding failure of the rain was, in the end, a political and theological catastrophe, as much as it was an ecological one. The Kuhul Ajah had staked his absolute authority on a guarantee, divine favor and prosperity in exchange for tribute and blood. The silent sky was the ultimate betrayal of that guarantee. As the megadroughts took hold, the people of the cities faced an impossible choice: starve to death in the shadow of a king who had lost his divine mandate, or abandon the holy center for the marginally more survivable, dispersed countryside. The decision to leave was not a sudden stampede, but a protracted, agonizing act of survival. The last dates carved on the stele, those desperate, final declarations of power, marked the moment the people of the South finally lost faith in the divine kingship. When the reservoirs dried up and the maize crops withered, the king's blood was no longer seen as a sacred offering. It was a futile spectacle. This fundamental loss of faith is what triggered the total societal collapse that we see in the silent, abandoned cities. Without the tribute from the farmers, the king could no longer feed his court, his army, or his craftsmen. The great public works were abandoned, the trade routes dissolved, and the center could no longer hold. The desperate, escalating warfare we see in the late classic period was the grim, inevitable byproduct of this failure. Starving cities warring over the last reliable water sources and the last patches of fertile land. The violence and the drought fed each other in a final, deadly feedback loop. The drought triggered the desperation, and the resulting warfare made it impossible to organize the society-wide labor needed for agriculture, making the famine even worse. It was a vicious cycle that left no room for recovery. The grand, brilliant experiment of the classic Maya in the southern lowlands had reached its tragic conclusion. The sophisticated city-states, unable to adapt their rigid political structure to an unyielding environmental crisis, crumbled, their inhabitants dispersing to find a new way to survive without the promise of a king's rule. The mystery of the classic Maya collapse is, therefore, not a case with a single, simple answer. There was no one smoking gun, no single invading army or plague that brought down this magnificent civilization. Instead, modern science and archaeological decipherment have revealed a much more complex and infinitely more tragic story. It is a story of a perfect storm, where a series of interconnected, self-inflicted, and external crises fed into one another, creating a devastating cascade of failure from which the Maya of the southern lowlands could not possibly recover. The foundation for the disaster had been subtly and tragically laid over centuries. As we have seen, the very success of the classic Maya, their massive, brilliant populations, and their competitive, ostentatious temple building, led to widespread, unchecked deforestation and the relentless erosion of their already fragile, thin soils. They had pushed their environment to its absolute, unforgiving limit, creating a brilliant but incredibly brittle civilization with no effective margin for error. They were a people living precariously on an environmental knife's edge, utterly dependent on predictable weather. Into this profoundly vulnerable world came the trigger, the inescapable final catastrophe, the century-long period of severe, unprecedented drought that began around 750 AD. The vital seasonal rains, which the Maya had depended upon for 1,000 years, became unreliable and then failed altogether, culminating in devastating megadroughts. The great reservoirs dried up, and the maize crops, the economic and sacred foundation of their entire society, withered in the fields, leading to widespread, devastating famine and mass migration. Faced with a crisis that their ancestors had never imagined, and with their traditional, fragile agricultural system completely destroyed, the divine kings, the Ajah, responded in the only way their centuries-old culture knew how. They went to war. But these were no longer the traditional, ritualized conflicts of the past. This was desperate, total warfare, a brutal struggle between starving cities for control of the last remaining fertile lands and reliable water sources. This violent, desperate response, however, only accelerated the catastrophe in a deadly, final feedback loop. Constant, brutal warfare pulled essential farmers away from their fields, making the famine and the resource scarcity even worse. It shattered the vital trade routes that brought in essential goods, and it turned the entire countryside into a place of terror, forcing the populations to flee the urban centers that had become death traps of thirst and violence. The collapse of the classic Maya is a haunting testament to the fragility of even the most sophisticated human endeavors. The civilization did not vanish overnight. It was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts, all stemming from an inability to adapt a rigid, centralized, and competitive political system to a rapidly changing, self-degraded environment. By the time the final drought hit, the Maya had essentially exhausted their social and ecological resilience. The city-states were so locked into their competitive building and warring that they could not cooperate on large-scale water management or resource conservation, sealing their own fate. The great cities of the southern lowlands, Tikal, Copan, Palenque, were swallowed by the jungle, their magnificent temples left as silent, tragic monuments to a system that had failed its people. The kings were gone, the ritual fires extinguished, and the voice of the steely silenced. Yet, the story of the Maya is not one of total extinction. The people dispersed, they moved north, and their culture endured. Their descendants still live in the region today, maintaining aspects of their language, their knowledge, and their connection to the land and the maize. The historical narrative shifted to the Yucatan, to cities like Chichen Itza, where the tradition flowered anew, forever proving the resilience of the people, even as their central political system failed. Ultimately, the silent cities of the jungle offer a profound and timeless lesson for our own era. They remind us that human ingenuity, however brilliant, the invention of zero, the creation of an accurate calendar, the construction of colossal pyramids, is not enough if it is not tempered by a deep, sustainable respect for the environment that supports it. The Maya proved that a civilization can be undone by its own internal contradictions, a belief in the ability to control the cosmos that blinded them to the reality of their own ecological limits. The silence that now rests upon the magnificent ruins is a permanent, cautionary echo, a warning that the health of the environment is the ultimate foundation of any lasting society, and that even the most powerful kings cannot bargain with a changing sky. The mystery is solved, but the tragedy is eternal.